Are you in favor of the reform, but are concerned about it causing a social rift? Are you worried about the reform and about a social rift? There is a solution, but first, let's begin by understanding the problem from both sides. Those in favor of the reform claim that there's a problem. The government is supposed to represent the people, but it can't always do so because sometimes the Supreme Court overturns government decisions, preventing it from representing the people. How does this happen? First, the court can overrule a law that was introduced by the Knesset with a simple majority of judges. Second, the Supreme Court in Israel is composed of a majority of liberal judges and only a minority of conservative judges. The Supreme Court's ruling is final and cannot be overruled by the government. This is how the Supreme Court is able to impose a liberal agenda even though a large portion of the nation is conservative. On the other hand, those who are against the reform claim that the Supreme Court acts to protect human rights and that all decisions are made based solely on legal and professional considerations. Those in favor of the reform disagree. They say that every case that is submitted to the Supreme Court is comprised of two conflicting values, and the judges rule in favor of one of these values according to their world outlook. That's why conservative and liberal judges reach different verdicts. The Supreme Court judges, therefore, do not represent a large portion of the nation. They also ask, if most of the judges of the Supreme Court were conservative, would you still give them absolute power to overrule government decisions? It seems that a change is needed. But the question is, does the proposed reform offer a feasible solution? Those who object to the reform claim that the first rule of politics is that whoever has the most power will try to leverage it to gain even more power, and will do so time and again. In a democracy, we prevent one entity from accumulating all the power by a balance between different institutions. In Israel, this balance is maintained between the Supreme Court and the government. But if the reform is realized, the government will hold all of the power. First, following the reform, a majority of 61 Knesset members will suffice for overruling decisions made by the Supreme Court, rendering the court unable to limit the Knesset. In addition, following the reform, the composition of the Judicial Selection Committee will be altered, enabling the coalition to appoint or remove Supreme Court judges. Thus, the coalition might appoint judges based on their loyalty to the government rather than based on professional considerations. In these circumstances, the government will have unlimited power, and we may find ourselves slipping into a state of dictatorship. Those in favor of the reform remind us of examples of democratic states where the legislator can overturn Supreme Court rulings, or where politicians may appoint judges. In response, those who oppose the reform explain that those countries have additional power functions that can restrain the government, such as constitution, two houses of representatives, separation between the president and the parliament, a local authority, or international treaties. Yet in Israel, the sole restrainer of the government is the Supreme Court. In response, those in favor of the reform say there is an additional restrainer, the people, and the people will not allow the government to make unreasonable decisions. To this, those who are against a reform reply, indeed, the people are an important restraining component in a democracy, but in any democratic state, restraint is imposed by both the people and institutions. So what will happen if we leave all of the restraint in the hands of the people? Are you willing to take that risk? If that were to happen, either the government will be restrained, or we will find ourselves living in a dictatorship. And let's be honest, none of us can predict what will actually happen. So what should we choose? Better representation of the people with a greater chance of a dictatorship, or worse representation of the people in order to prevent a dictatorship? Our answer is both. Let's prevent a dictatorship and represent the people. Here is one way to do so. First, the Supreme Court, the coalition, and the opposition will agree to create a balanced composition of liberal and conservative Supreme Court judges. This will occur by maintaining the balance between these three powers within the Judicial Selection Committee. Second, the Supreme Court will only overturn Knesset laws through a special majority of judges so that only extreme laws are overturned. Third, likewise, the Knesset will only overturn Supreme Court rulings through a special majority to ensure that only extreme rulings are overturned. This way, the government can give the people what they want, and the Supreme Court will ensure that we don't slip into a dictatorship. This conflict could deepen the public rift, or we could sit down together and find a solution. Do you also think that we should sit down together to find a solution? You can help. Please send this video to everyone you know and sign the petition calling our leaders to stop, sit down, and talk.